Let me ask you something, and try not to answer too quickly. Have you ever felt a truth approaching you before you actually heard it? Like a vibration in the air, a tension under your skin, a moment when the world behaves as if it's holding its breath? If you can feel that sensation right now, keep it, because the story I'm about to tell you doesn't walk toward you gently. It creeps in like the sound of footsteps you weren't expecting. It arrives with the weight of a confession no one wanted to make. And before we go any further, do me a favor. Place yourself inside this next thought. Imagine standing in a quiet room, no voices, no music, just the steady rhythm of your own pulse, and realizing that the silence around you isn't empty. It's waiting. That's how Minas Gerais felt in 1870, a land carved by gold fever and arrogance, where mountains had secrets older than the mansions built upon them. The air was thick with iron dust, Catholic bells, and the unspoken rule that every person had a place they were forbidden to leave. And in the middle of this rigid world stood Coronel Estevao Farias, a man who believed the sun rose because he owned land large enough to catch its first light, a man whose voice could silence an entire plantation, a man who treated the law less as a guide and more as a mirror, reflecting whatever benefited him. But this story is not about him. Not really. This story is about his only son, Lorenzo. Picture him with me for a moment. 19 years old, a face still carrying traces of a childhood he never truly lived, raised inside walls so polished they reflected everything except kindness. A young man taught to command before he understood compassion, to inherit before he learned to choose. Now, breathe in slowly and hold that image, because to understand why everything turned to blood, you need to see the contrast that shaped him. The Coronel's plantation, São Bento de Serra, stretched across the hills like a kingdom carved into the land. Whitewashed buildings, long rows of coffee fields bending under sun, and behind the senzala, the slave quarters, an orchard that smelled of sweet guava in the early mornings. That orchard was where Lorenzo first saw her. Her name was Maria das Dores. 16, skin the color of polished cedar, eyes that held both defiance and something softer, something she protected like a flame cupped in her hands. She didn't speak much, at least not when overseers were nearby. But when she walked, there was a quiet strength in her steps, a rhythm that felt older than the land itself. Lorenzo noticed her before he even understood what was happening to him. He noticed a small braid she kept tucked behind her ear. He noticed the way she hummed softly when she thought no one was listening. He noticed that his chest tightened whenever she lifted her gaze toward him, even if just for a second. And here's the part most people never admit out loud. Some connections don't begin with words. They begin with recognition. A sudden, inexplicable awareness that someone else carries a spark that speaks directly to yours. For Lorenzo, that recognition felt like standing barefoot on cold stone, shocking, grounding, impossible to ignore. But this wasn't a world built for tenderness. This was Brazil in 1870, a land where slavery had been bleeding for more than 3 centuries, and every breath taken by an enslaved woman was considered property. So let me ask you, what happens when love grows in a place designed to crush it? Because that's exactly what happened. Not a fairy tale romance, not a secret poem tucked into a pocket. It was something rawer, quieter, almost reluctant, like a wound learning to open. Their paths crossed again weeks later, near the old well behind the sugar barn. It was dawn, the sky still gray, and steam rose from the damp earth. Maria das Dores was carrying a wooden bucket. It was too heavy. He saw her stumble. Instinct, human instinct, moved him forward before he remembered the rules. "Let me help," he said. She froze, not from fear, from calculation, because a woman in her position learned to read danger the way other people read weather. When she didn't answer, he took the handle slowly, carefully, like approaching a wounded animal unsure whether to trust a hand being offered. For a moment, just a moment, their fingers brushed, and that was enough. Something shifted, something dangerous, something unforgivable by every law of that land. Weeks passed, and the universe kept finding ways to place them in the same space. Near the orchard, near the well, near the chapel steps where candles melted into small pools of wax that smelled like honey and smoke. They barely spoke. A few glances, half-finished phrases. But silence could be a language too, the kind that speaks beneath words, beneath rules, beneath fear. And silence is what the Coronel feared most. Not rebellion, not disobedience. Silence, because silence meant secrets. And secrets meant loss of control. Now breathe again, slow and steady, because this is where the ground begins to tilt. One night, a storm rolled over the valley, lightning tearing the sky open, rain pounding like fists against the earth. And in that storm, the unthinkable happened. Lorenzo disappeared from the main house. He was found hours later in the senzala, not harming anyone, not threatening anyone, just sitting beside Maria das Dores, both of them drenched from the storm, both trembling, not from cold, but from the truth neither could escape anymore. He loved her, and she, God help her, had begun to love him too. But love between the powerless and the privileged is never just love. It becomes a weapon, a sin, a crack in a hierarchy that keeps cruel systems standing. And the plantation would soon make them pay for it. This is the moment where whispers turn into wounds. In the next block, we step into the part of the story that no one tells in textbooks. The spies, the betrayal, the Coronel's fury, and the night when Minas Gerais itself seemed to hold its breath before the blood. Before we continue, do one thing for me. Put yourself inside the body of someone who knows a storm is coming, but can't do a damn thing to stop it. That's the feeling Lorenzo carried the morning after the storm. A strange mix of clarity and dread. Like finally seeing the road ahead and realizing it might lead straight into a cliff. Because when he returned to the main house, soaked, muddy, and trembling from what he could no longer hide, someone had already spoken. In every plantation, there was always one pair of eyes that watched too closely. One person who noticed schedules, footsteps, patterns. One person who survived by trading secrets. That person was Galdino, an enslaved man forced into the role of informant. A position cursed by everyone who understood the weight of betrayal, yet pitted by those who knew exactly how fear can twist a human life. Galdino didn't choose to speak. He spoke because silence had cost him teeth, ribs, or breath. And he whispered the truth to the Coronel before dawn broke. The Coronel listened without blinking. Men like him didn't explode, they calcified. His silence turned the room colder than rain ever could. Now imagine the sound of your heartbeat echoing too loud inside your own skull. That's how Lorenzo felt when he stepped into the dining hall and saw his father at the head of the table. No breakfast was served, just judgment. Where were you? The Coronel's voice was strangely calm, which was worse than rage. People feared his anger, but they learned to dread his composure. Lorenzo hesitated, not because he wanted to lie, but because the truth suddenly felt like a loaded weapon. I was walking, he said, but lies fall apart when truth is breathing too close behind them. You were seen, the Coronel replied, down by the senzala, with her, as if her name could stain the air. As if speaking Maria das Dores aloud would make the walls themselves mutiny. Lorenzo opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What defense exists for something the world has already decided is unforgivable? The Coronel stood. He was not a tall man, but cruelty gives people a shadow larger than their bodies. Do you understand what you've done? He asked. You have shamed this house. You have stepped beneath your station. And worse, you have treated one of my slaves as if she were equal to you. This was the world Lorenzo had been born into, but suddenly he saw it from the wrong side. He felt the cage around him for the first time. I'm not ashamed, he whispered. It was a soft sentence. But soft things can be dangerous when spoken in forbidden places. The Coronel's hand struck his son across the face. Not out of fury, out of fear. Because men who build their lives on hierarchies panic when those hierarchies collapse. Lorenzo staggered back. A metallic taste filled his mouth. Still, he didn't look away. And that was the moment the Coronel realized something irreversible. His son would rather bleed than obey. But the story doesn't turn to tragedy simply because a father is cruel. No, the tragedy comes from what happens when cruelty is paired with power. Within hours, the Coronel issued a new order quietly, privately. Maria das Dores was to be punished. Not killed, not sold, just disciplined, enough to break whatever spirit had tempted his son into madness. But fate, sometimes tender, sometimes merciless, intervened. The order was overheard. There were women in the Senzala who had raised Maria das Dores like a younger sister. Men who'd seen too many girls dragged behind barns and returned different, quieter, emptied out. People who understood that punishment wasn't punishment. It was annihilation wearing another name. So a plan formed. Not rebellion, not mutiny. A rescue. A desperate, dangerous rescue. Meanwhile, Lorenzo was confined to his room, guarded by 2 armed men. He paced. He pressed his ear to the door. He tried to speak through the wooden panels. Tried to explain to guards who weren't allowed to listen. And outside, dusk arrived with unnatural stillness. Even the cicadas fell silent. This is a part where the past feels close enough to touch. Because everything that happened next has been retold in fragments through generations, each version slightly different, but all agreeing on one thing. The night of the rescue didn't feel human. It felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Just after midnight, rain began to fall, not heavy, just enough to blur footprints, enough to turn torch flames nervous. 3 enslaved men approached the back wall of the Senzala, not with weapons, with intention. Inside, Maria das Dores had already been pulled aside by older women, her wrists trembling as they tried to tell her what awaited her at sunrise. "You have to leave," one of them whispered. "They won't stop at a beating. Not when it's the Coronel's honor at stake." Honor. What a strange word, used so often by men who never understood the weight of it. Maria das Dores felt the walls closing around her. She didn't want to run. She didn't want to vanish into the dark, like a condemned shadow. Her heart was tangled between terror and something that felt too close to hope. Hope she had never dared name. And then she heard the tapping. 3 knocks against the back wall. A signal. One of the men pushed a loose board aside, just enough to see inside. "Maria," he whispered. "Now." The women helped her through the gap. And for a brief second, her fingers lingered on theirs. An unspoken prayer, a goodbye, a thank you, a promise all at once. But fate is a cruel composer. It doesn't let tenderness go unpunished. As Maria das Dores slipped into night, a shadow moved near the barn. Galdino, the informant, he wasn't supposed to be awake. He wasn't supposed to be watching. But fear had made him restless, pacing the yard like a man waiting for thunder. He saw the movement. He saw the escape. He ran. And this exact moment was where the story sealed itself in blood. Because the Coronel heard Galdino's frantic footsteps. He burst from his room, pistol in hand, furious enough to blind himself to consequences. The enslaved rescuers fled. But Maria das Dores froze. She didn't freeze out of weakness. She froze because she heard something else. Lorenzo shouting from inside the house, calling her name. Her name. Just once. But once was enough to splinter the night. She didn't run. She turned. And that turn, God help us all, was a single act that changed every life on that plantation. In the next block, we step into the crime that tore the valley apart. The vengeance that erupted like wildfire, and the night when love and death met at the same threshold. The blood has not yet fallen, but it will, and when it does, it won't now. Before we step into what happened next, I want you to breathe once, slowly, because the moment we're about to enter is the kind of moment that leaves a scar long after the story is over. Maria das Dores turned toward the sound of Lorenzo's voice, not toward safety, not toward freedom. Toward him. That single instinct, human, dangerous, undeniable, placed her directly in the path of the Coronel. Lightning flashed behind the mountains, illuminating the courtyard in a white, ghostly flare. Rain fell harder. Shadows stretched. The Coronel raised his pistol. And for a second, for one impossible, fragile second, Lorenzo appeared at the top of the steps. He'd managed to push past the guards. His shirt was torn, his face still bleeding from earlier, his breath uneven. "Father, stop." But the Coronel was no longer a father. Not in that moment. He was a man possessed by the terror of losing control over his land, his legacy, his reputation, and now his own son. Maria das Dores didn't move. She didn't plead. She simply stared at him, shoulders squared, as if refusing to let her last moment be one of fear. The pistol fired, a sharp crack that split the silence of the valley. But fate, ever merciless, twisted the bullet's path, because Lorenzo lunged forward at the exact same moment, screaming her name so loudly it felt like the air itself shook. The bullet struck him, not in the heart, not in the head, but just beneath the collarbone, tearing through flesh, erupting into a spray that painted the stone steps red. He fell, hard. Maria das Dores ran toward him with a sound that no language can capture, something between a cry, a prayer, and an animal's grief. The Coronel froze. His arm dropped. The pistol clattered to the ground, because only then did he understand that he had done the one thing he feared more than scandal. He had broken his bloodline with his own hands. Lorenzo gasped, his breath wet, bubbling. She knelt beside him, lifting his head, her palms trembling as they pressed against the wound. "Stay with me," she whispered, voice cracking. I'm right here. Rain washed the blood across the stone, turning it into thin rivers that curled around their knees. "Maria," he breathed. His voice was soft, but determined, as if he were fighting to place each word into the world before it was too late. "I didn't come to save you. You saved me." And then his eyes began to dim, flickering like a flame struggling in the wind. But the story doesn't end with a dying boy in his lover's arms. No, if it had, this would have been only a tragedy. But what happened next turned it into something far larger, something that would echo through Minas Gerais for generations, because the enslaved community had been watching. They had seen the Coronel raise a pistol. They had seen Lorenzo fall. And in that courtyard, illuminated by lightning, something in their collective spirit snapped. Not quietly, not reluctantly, with force. They had endured lashes. They had buried friends. They had listened to screams in barns and cellars. But this moment was different. They saw a young man choose love over power. They saw a woman they considered family forced into a nightmare she did not deserve. And they saw the system, naked and violent, destroy the one thing that had dared to challenge it. The enslaved men and women of São Bento de Serra didn't decide to rebel. They reacted, like a body reacting to a blade. It began with the three men who had tried to help Maria escape. They rushed toward her, toward Lorenzo, toward the Coronel, who now stumbled backward in shock. Then others emerged from the darkness, women with fire in their eyes, men gripping farm tools like weapons, older children whose small hands clenched with the anger of generations. Galdino, the informant, froze where he stood. For the first time in years, he understood that fear could be pointed in more than one direction. And in the center of the courtyard, the Coronel, the man who claimed total control, was suddenly very, very small. He lifted his hands. This is madness," he stammered. "He chose to disobey me. I didn't mean..." But blood was already pooling beneath Lorenzo's body. A father's excuses couldn't cover that. One of the elder women, known as Mea Figenia, took a step forward. Her voice was steady, ancient, shaped by the pain of too many lifetimes. "You killed your own son to keep us in chains," she said. "You killed what little soul you had left." The Coronel tried to back away, but the crowd moved with him. Maria das Dores never let go of Lorenzo's body. Even as chaos surged around her, she held him close, whispering words that belonged to another world, a world where freedom existed, where love wasn't a crime punished by bullets. And then someone shouted, "Now!" It happened fast, too fast for any orderly record to capture. Tools were raised, torches were lit, walls were pushed. The overseers fled or were struck down. What followed was not a planned rebellion. It was collective grief turning into collective fire. The barn ignited first. The flames crawled up its wooden beams, crackling like laughter from something ancient and furious. The Coronel ran toward the stables, screaming for help that wouldn't come. His boots slipped in the mud, his breath toward his throat. Behind him, dozens of voices rose, not in chant, not in celebration, but in a sound raw and primal. Enough. By the time he reached the door, the enslaved men had surrounded him, Galdino tried to flee, but someone caught him by the shirt. He didn't die. They didn't kill him. They simply pushed him to his knees and let him feel the consequences of his choices. Not with strikes, but with silence. But the coronel faced a different fate. History records his death in vague, uncomfortable lines, as if trying to hide the truth beneath polite wording. But oral tradition, passed down in whispers, tells a far more human story. They didn't torture him. They didn't draw it out. They simply gave him what he had created. A world where mercy did not exist. He begged. He promised. He sobbed. He spoke of God. He spoke of law. He spoke of order. But the mountain didn't listen. The flames didn't listen. And neither did those who had spent their lives beneath his boots. What happened next was swift and final. And when it was over, the valley fell silent. The rebellion lasted only minutes. Minutes that shattered a dynasty. The overseers fled into the storms. Animals broke free from their pens. The barn collapsed in a sheet of sparks. Smoke thickened over the courtyard like a shroud. And in the middle of the destruction, Maria das Dores remained on her knees, cradling the body of the only man who had ever looked at her without seeing property. Lorenzo's final breath left his lips just as dawn began to touch the horizon. Their love had lasted only weeks, but its consequences would burn for generations, because the aftermath, the trials, the rumors, the legends, had only just begun. In the next block, we entered the part of the story that history tried to bury. How the empire responded, how Maria das Dores survived, how the valley spoke of ghosts for decades, and the final words Lorenzo left behind, words that reshaped the fate of every. Before we walk into the aftermath, do something with me? Sit with the silence for just a second. Let your body feel what happens when a storm has already passed. Not the violence of the moment, but the strange emptiness that follows. That's exactly what Minas Gerais felt the morning after Lorenzo died in Maria das Dores' arms. The plantation was unrecognizable. The barn was a skeleton of blackened beams. The stables were empty, hooves having struck mud for miles in the night. Smoke clung to the valley like a veil that refused to lift. And the main house, usually immaculate, stood with its doors open, as if the building itself no longer believed it had the right to close. Word spread quickly, not through letters, but through whispers carried by travelers, muleteers, and merchants who felt the tension in the air as soon as they reached the region. Something happened at São Bento de Serra. Something big, something bloody. And when local authorities finally arrived days later, too late for justice, but early enough for blame, they found a story they were not prepared to face. A coronel killed by the very people he ruled. A son dead beside the Senzala. A woman alive who should not have been. A rebellion that lasted less than an hour, but shattered the illusion of control the empire depended on. You need to understand the political climate to grasp the full weight of this. In 1870, Brazil was a nation cracking at its seams. Abolitionist movements were gaining strength. Intellectuals in Rio and Recife were beginning to speak openly, dangerously, about freedom. And the government, terrified of appearing weak, reacted to any sign of rebellion with harshness disguised as order. So when they saw the ruins of São Bento, they didn't see grief. They didn't see a father's bullet. They didn't see love. They saw a threat. They arrested everyone they could find. Old men with swollen joints who hadn't run fast enough. Women still trembling from smoke and loss. Teenagers whose hands carried soot but no blood. Even Galdino, the informant, because betrayers are rarely rewarded by the systems they serve. But Maria das Dores was not taken. And the reason why remains one of the most mysterious pieces of the story. Some say Maya Figenia hid her in a cave along the ridge, feeding her at night until the soldiers went away. Some say the enslaved community created a network of escapes that move her from farm to farm like a ghost in the wind. Some say she was protected by Lorenzo's last words, words only a handful of people ever heard, but which travel farther than any decree. Here is one version, whispered through generations. As Lorenzo's breath faltered, he pressed his blood-soaked hand against Maria's cheek and whispered, "Live, not for me, but because they never wanted you to." And something in that sentence, raw, tragic, defiant, spread like embers through every enslaved person who survived that night. When soldiers asked where she was, nobody answered. Not out of fear, out of principle, out of loyalty, out of the belief that this woman had already paid too high a price for a love she never asked for. Without her, the investigation unraveled. Officials blamed outsiders, bandits, even abolitionists. Anything was easier than admitting the truth. A plantation had devoured itself. The system had collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. In court records, the Coronel's death was labeled insurrection by slaves, but those who lived the story knew better. It was not rebellion. It was consequence. The Empire sentenced a handful of people, mostly men who hadn't even been near the courtyard when the killing happened. Some were sent to prison colonies. Some vanished into chain gangs. Some died before their sentences were even recorded. But a strange thing happened in the valley that no judge could erase. People kept talking about Lorenzo, not as the heir of a dynasty, not as the arrogant boy many assumed he was, but as the young man who had chosen humanity over hierarchy. Someone who had stepped out his father's shadow, even if only at the end. Someone who saw beauty where others saw ownership. A story like that, it refuses to die. Over the years, travelers passing through Minas Gerais reported hearing things, quiet things, unsettling things. A woman's voice humming near the orchard that no longer existed. Footsteps around the old well during storms. A shadow kneeling at the stones where the blood had long washed away. A young man silhouette at dawn, standing as if watching for someone he'd never see again. Were these ghosts? Memories? Symptoms of a valley that had witnessed too much? Maybe all three. What we do know, what we can confirm through documents, oral histories, and the stubborn persistence of truth, is this. Sao Bento de Serra was abandoned within 10 years. No one wanted the land. No one wanted the curse. No one wanted the weight of what had happened there. Some say Maria das Dores eventually reached to Quilombo, one of the free black communities hidden in the mountain forests. Others believe she crossed into Rio de Janeiro disguised as a freedwoman. A few say she lived quietly, anonymously, raising a child whose father the world would never know. But no version of the story allows her to go back. There was nothing left to return to. And generations later, locals still repeat a single haunting line, a line believed to be the final whispered phrase Lorenzo ever spoke before the world fell silent around him. A line that closes his story the way a wound closes around a shard of glass. Not healed, not clean, but unforgettable. The blood they spilled was never mine alone. Let that sit with you. Let it echo, because some stories aren't meant to comfort. Some exist to remind us that history is not just dates and names. It is the sum of every choice made in the shadows, every injustice carried in silence, every love punished for daring to exist in the wrong century. And this story, with all its heartbreak and fire, leaves us with one truth that refuses to fade. What dies in the body survives in the memory. What is buried in silence returns as a voice. And what was built on cruelty always crumbles, no matter how many generations try to pretend otherwise.